Hello and welcome to AFAL Podcasts, the home of objective, up-to-date and independent reporting on Turkey. Don't forget to follow our reports through social media, on afalnews.com or through our mobile app. Let's get started. We're going back to the mid-20th century, decades when the Western world was seeing a wave of protests fueled by Cold War conflicts and a very marked divide between left and right. A time when a person's political beliefs could see them face very serious consequences, as was seen during the McCarthy trials. It was also a time when the Black Civil Rights Movement was in full swing in the United States. All these political struggles compelled a generation of people to seek places of shelter far from their home countries.
Turkey had a unique place as a destination for these exiles, in particular Istanbul, where many people found a welcoming home. Among them, the most famous one was American writer and thinker James Baldwin, who stayed in Istanbul on and off for a decade, starting from early 60s to the 70s. Baldwin found there a space to think and write on issues he was facing back home, in particular the discrimination against Black and gay people. And he also made friends with a diverse range of characters, including the great Kurdish writer Yaşar Kemal and the Turkish actor Engin Cezar, with whom he wrote and staged a play. Baldwin also spent time in Istanbul socializing with a community of exiles, people who had settled in and around the Robert College, an institute set up by a U.S. missionary in the 19th century. Some part of Robert College later became Boğaziçi University, one of Turkey's leading universities.
This clique of exiles and lost souls was known as a hill crowd because they lived on or around the hill overlooking the Bosphorus where the Robert College campus was located. They were known for their wild parties and bohemian lifestyle as much as for their influence on generations of Turkish students. The late academic and writer Maureen Freely was an important member of the hill crowd, as well as a prolific writer on Istanbul. His final book, Istanbul Ghosts, published by Cornucopia and with photographs by the legendary Ara Güler, tells a lively, humorous and sometimes tragic stories of those exiles. We're here with Maureen Freely's daughter, the writer and translator Maureen Freely, who's going to tell us her own account of that unique time in Istanbul's history.
Well, first of all, for me, they're not peculiar people. Everybody in America was peculiar. And I think what people had in common, they came one by one. Sometimes they came because they made a friend, like Jimmy Baldwin met Engin Cezar, and he was a lifelong friend, and so he came to visit and he fell in love with it. A lot of people came to teach at the English-speaking schools, so Robert College, as Boğaziçi University was then known, Robert Academy, the Girls' College, the English High School, the Üsküdar Girls' Lycée, and sometimes the consulate. So if they fell in love with Turkey and stayed there, it was a bit of a defection for them. It was much harder for them. The others just came to get out of Cold War America and were often traveling around, not intending to stay in Istanbul. And one after the other fell in love with Istanbul and couldn't leave. Now, I'm saying Cold War America, Cold War Europe. So sometimes, as in my father's case, there was a very political side to that. He wasn't politically active, but he was left-leaning to the extent that his nickname or his assumed given middle name was full name with the middle name is John Class Struggle Freely. And he was caught as a physicist getting his doctorate in the middle of the McCarthy witch hunts. He was not targeted, but all of his mentors were removed from their posts and investigated, and some of them committed suicide. And so he saw this at first hand, and he thought it was sick. And add to that, that's the political side. On the other extreme is the romantic side, which is my mother. And there were many people like her, so I give her as an example. She grew up in a kind of lower middle class family that had a lot of music in their life, but it was mainly ragtime and the blues and so on. Not the blues, sorry, ragtime. And American folk music and so on. And my mother started listening to opera on the public radio, and it was in order to uplift the masses. Everybody else in her family hated it. They'd say, turn that off. But she decided that there was a more interesting place called Europe, where it lived like the opera, and she was absolutely determined to get there. And she was very, very beautiful, and she kept on turning away boring prospects that her parents kept bringing to her until she found John Class Struggle Freely. And so he had always promised to take her around the world once he got his doctorate, and that is actually what he did. Now, the other people they met when they got to Istanbul, if we're going to start talking about the Hill and the Hill people, didn't accept them right away because they were all, like me, Ivy League. They'd all been to, Harvard and Yale and Princeton more than any other place, really. And the women had been to Mount Holyoke, Wellesley, Smith, and other august women's institutions. So that's, and they had all wanted to leave because their parents were controlling their lives too much, and they wanted to have fun. You have, in the exiles coming out of North America at that time, you have a lot of people who had what you might call a good war, where they went places in the war that taught them that there was a bigger world than the one that their parents had told them existed, and they just wanted out, and they wanted more freedom. You also had many what we would call LGBT now. There wasn't really a word that we even used then. It was just that well over half of my parents' friends were men who loved men and women who loved women, and that was completely normal to me. I know that they used to get upset more often than our married parents, because our married parents were better at hiding it, I think. So you had people who were for sexual or personal or political or romantic reasons were coming, and then they found each other. Bear in mind that homosexuality was against the law at the time when a lot of these people came, and so the people in our lovely community who were from the UK were often, very, very often, seeking some kind of refuge so that they could love whoever they wanted to love.
Can I ask, what time period exactly are we talking about?
We're talking about post-World War II. Right. We got to Istanbul in 1960 when I was 8, and everything was very much in full swing by then. The other thing about this particular community, which is different from a number of the other expatriate communities or communities of exiles that I ran into later on in Greece and in Lebanon and in Spain, was that it was very, very closely tied with a certain group of artists and intellectuals downtown, as we called it. And because of Istanbul being the way it is, there were a number of these coming out of educational institutions again. So you had, following on from the old Ottoman mode, you had an Anglophone sphere of influence, which was itself divided a little bit. We were never invited at the Queen's birthday party.
Were these Turkish intellectuals?
Yes. But they had been. So you had the French group, the German group, a smaller Italian, and quite a large Anglophone group because there were so many more schools. So These were people who had come through that educational system.
Italian schools, French schools, English schools.
But for ours, they'd come through the English-speaking schools, and there were quite a few of those. And they made very, very good friends with some of their students after they graduated, and they stayed involved. And so a shining example is Hilary Sumner Boyd, who was my Latin teacher, and I was his obstreperous student. He used to always call me obstreperous. I didn't know what obstreperous meant until he called me that. So there's one good reason to misbehave, which is what obstreperous implies. He comes from a really unusual background. his father was very famous radical, American radical, wobbly. So it's like he was a kind of union organizer, and his mother was a very, very controversial suffragist, and she took him back to Britain, and so you would never know he'd had an American, molecule in him. He was very, very Oxbridge, yeah. But he'd run the Trotsky Society at Oxford, and then he got out of politics at a certain point, and his great interest was drama. So he started this extraordinary drama group with Robert Academy people, so it was lycée people, who then went on to really dominate the next generation of Turkish drama, and they remained very, very close. Engin Cezar was one of them. Okay, so that's so it's not just people making friends at parties. There were very, very strong interests, artistic interests or interest in history. The other big romance, and it was a discovery because nobody was talking about Turkey or the history of the lands of Turkey outside Turkey or even inside Turkey, for that matter, at that time. And so there were no guides. And what I remember is every time we had a few weeks off, a group of us would set out for a new part of Anatolia. Every weekend, a new part of Istanbul. And it would be a discovery. We'd bump into ruins. We'd find cities that were had not been on any maps that we'd ever seen. And there was this almost religious awe that they felt about this incredibly rich, gorgeous place that had been, lost to the memory of the rest of the world, and as I said, to Turkey at that time. So they were all often really, really puzzled that their students were embarrassed by things that were old, and there were wonderful conversations about that, and a lot of those conversations, all of those conversations, transformed the teachers as much as it did the students, if you like. Yeah.
Are these the Turkish students?
Yeah, Turkish, all Turkish. Yeah, in those days.
And why would that be?
That's because Turkey, the Republic of Turkey, had a difficult task with knowing what to do with its own history or the prehistory of the Republic, and so it's something that I think takes several generations to accommodate, if that. I don't think I'm speaking as somebody who's born in another country that has a big problem with that, and that's the United States. It is, and so you could say that these people. Well, actually, my father did go back to Boston. He almost began his guidebook. He'd written like 30 guidebooks to Istanbul and the environs by then. And when he wrote the Blue Guide to Boston, he almost began it by saying, Boston is the only city in the world that sits astride two continents, because he was really used to saying that. So he did take that interest back with him, not just to the U.S., but Ireland, when he went to Ireland. Because by then, having explored Turkey a lot, he knew how to look at a surface and ask questions and read. But the most wonderful thing as a child was watching him. He didn't have to do much to inspire certain students who had interests beyond their subjects. I was not kind of an enlightened listener to his conversations about science, but it was the same thing. So he was always, if his students had as so many did, had an aptitude for science, or was just what we would call geniuses, he did everything he could to make sure that they could go abroad, do what they needed to do, and then come back to Turkey, where so many of them became his colleagues. And when he turned 80, and also when after he died, when we did the memorial, there were so many of his former students who then became his colleagues who talked about why they had said that my father walked in the first day of class and his heart went out to him because he was so badly dressed. I think he had red socks, as usual. I know those socks. Sorry.
So, we're talking about these foreign academics, foreign intellectuals who have come to Turkey, and they've escaped some either kind of political repression, we could say, or repression of other kind because of their sexuality, and they found in Turkey, an atmosphere of freedom, and discovery, and intellectual freedom, intellectual discovery. I mean, were they affected by the context they were in politically in Turkey?
I was. I remember when one of my novels set in Istanbul came out, I was being interviewed for a Turkish newspaper, and the interviewer said, why did your family come to Turkey? And I explained they were looking for freedom. And she went like this, and she said, ironic.
So why? I mean, just to set the scene, why was that ironic?
Because there was not very much freedom in Turkey at the time. That said, between 1960 and the late 60s, the 1970s, say there was that was one of those opening up periods when people were gaining more freedom of expression of the press and so on, and so there's that sense of a flowering, which turned into a sense of an explosion, later on.
Would you say that these circles, the hill people, as they're called, did they have any influence on that kind of flowering of expression in Turkey?
I think one of the stories I was brought up with that is so deeply ingrained in me that I have to fight it, even when I know that it's not true, is that we were not in Turkey to have a political influence. We were just there to enjoy the country and appreciate the country and educate. And so that was so there was this sort of internalized prohibition against being engaged with politics. People who had been engaged with politics had given it up. The cold warriors in the consulate and the intelligence people who were pretending to be heads of bicycle companies and so on. There was a big antipathy between these two groups. Around the late 60s, and so I was a teenager by then, the term cultural imperialist became very popular. And so it was explained to me by various very, very wealthy classmates who had become very left-wing, that type, that you were infecting a country by coming to educate people. And of course, that's very adolescent language. But of course, if you have an American educational system or school in Turkey, it is a different type of education. And I found it particularly interesting in my schools, because I went to the American College for Girls just before it joined with Robert Academy and became Robert College to confuse everybody forever after. Most of the subjects were taught in a very progressive American way in English. What do you think about that? Oh, you disagree with me. Oh, that's interesting. How do you disagree with me? And then the other subjects, history, geography, Turkish literature, and what was called then askerlik and then became milli güvenlik afterwards. They were in Turkish, and I didn't take those classes, but I would walk by, and the atmosphere was very, very different. They were some kind teachers, but there were a lot of dragons who were taught in a very old-fashioned way, and kalkmak, yeah. So do they still have kalkmak? Well, anyway, you'd have to stand in front of the class and recite the textbook.
Right.
So what does it do to people to be going back and forth and back and forth? The American teachers, the progressive teachers, never saw what their own students how many times they had to switch codes during the day.
Right.
I think it makes for a really good sense of humor. Once you survive it, it makes it. When people said, "Well, why is Turkey so good at postmodern?" It's because it is. Because you're having to, and then you're reading from a literature that comes from a very, very different history and culture, and then you go home to the simplicity, of a Kemalist family.
So you have
can't
to
see me rolling my eyes.
You have to constantly switch between expectations or different codes, different ways of expressing yourself.
Yeah. So, which is why Istanbul, I'll just take that, is the most interesting place in the world still, no matter how hard politicians try to purify it.
Right. And on the other hand, we're talking about the foreign people coming in and having an influence on Turkey. With the very little I've read about James Baldwin, he had to escape from pretty difficult circumstances back home, and he used Turkey as a kind of platform from which to write some of his best work.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, the one day, if I get my act together, what I'd like to look at is actually what happens in the exile groups that don't communicate with each other but go all over North Africa, the Middle East, and Europe, after the war, because there were so many of them. We always know about the so-called lost generation, Hemingway and Fitzgerald, et cetera, James Joyce, all in Paris. They're all going to the same cafes. They're all promoting themselves and publicizing themselves as a group. But if you start thinking about it, what happens with jazz? After World War II. First of all, World War II had a lot of African American soldiers who again found out that the world was not the way it was in their they're very limited and oppressed neighborhoods, and there was still segregation, but there wasn't in Europe. And so jazz would not be jazz that we know today unless if Europe hadn't welcomed a whole generation of jazz musicians who then just carried on with what they were already trying to do, and then went back and forth or went back. If you talk about the Beat generation, same thing. They would never become the Beat generation if they hadn't been able to come to Europe and catch their breath, and also come to this country and catch their breath. And it goes on and on like that. So I think wherever you are, you take your country. I mean, one of the interesting things about being in Istanbul in the 60s is the amount of time my parents and their friends said, we're American, but we're not that kind of American. We're not that kind of American. So they were very divided, as you'll see with the exile community anywhere. And you still are part of the place that you come from. You're still fighting the same things. To make it more bizarre for me and us, those of us who were the children, we were having an American education, and so I know all about Thomas Paine. I know all about George Washington and his wooden teeth, and I wouldn't tell a lie about the cherry tree. But it seems so remote. And thanks to my parents and their friends, I was finding out about the history of the country where we were, but never in class. And that is really, really strange when you start thinking about it. My whole attitude towards my country, which I still write at and to, is how far away it is, and why can't they hear me? Why can't they see me? So all of us who write from that have very remote American characters. I mean, really, they're on the far shore, looking strange. If you wanted to talk about Jimmy Baldwin in particular, there's something else that he was trying to get away from, and it was trying to get away from the claims of fame without having to say so. Yes, he was, as we would then say, homosexual. Yes, he'd written one of the greatest books about gay love by then, before he even came, Giovanni's Room. But what was happening in the early 60s, of course, was the Civil Rights Movement, in which he played a really, really important role, in that his essays in the New Yorker almost single-handedly defined the way that the American intelligentsia understood the issues of human rights. And he remained really, really centrally involved. He was also involved in the various types of direct action, or kickstarting various types of direct action on behalf, getting the mainstream whites, northern mostly, involved in the civil rights movement. But when you're that kind of famous, you become you cease to be able to be your own writer. You cease to have any freedom of expression whatsoever. And so in those lovely days before email and the internet, I mean, you could go to Turkey and people couldn't find you. I mean, letters sometimes arrived, they sometimes didn't. And phones, forget it, and they were very expensive. So you could actually go there and kind of disappear. as I went to his funeral in New York in, I think it was 1987 or 88, December 1987, I think it was, there was still a great unanswered question about why he'd left the U.S. So, but even there, they couldn't quite sort of understand France, but they couldn't quite understand Turkey. And so during the 1990s and afterwards, there was almost every summer there was an interesting African American academic who would come and interview us, saying, "Why was he here?" Because look around you.
Yeah. One of the nicest images in my mind's eye when I think about James Baldwin being in Turkey is him being on the Boğaziçi campus overlooking the Bosphorus with Yasser Kemal.
Yeah.
And they had good friends there.
Yeah.
Great contacts.
Yeah.
You read about great parties.
Yeah. I mean, I should mention the parties. My parents weren't immediately accepted, but everybody came to their parties, and that's how they they created their own center of that, and they really were wild. But the reason they were really wonderful is that so many people from downtown would come. Mm-hmm. So Ali Berger, my favorite, Hayalet Ul, Cevat Cevat, and they would always bring lots and lots of friends. So even when my parents stopped giving those parties, they would have to go at a certain point. It just got too much because people were bringing, but we'd have to go out for the evening. This is much later in the mid to late 70s. We would go out and stay out till like 2 a.m. But even then, big crowds would be arriving at 3 or 4 a.m. There was lots of Irish music because my father liked to dance, do that, the Irish dancing, and lots of Greek music. And then anything else people cared to put on, as long as it was wild. And then the parents and politicians who would be just outraged by the way they were behaving. And I think it was something coming out of the Second World War. I think that's what shaped them. I was shaped by the Cold War. They were shaped by the Second World War. I once asked my father, why did you take us children to so many dangerous places? And he said, oh, but you don't understand. And during the war, I saw the whole world in ruin. So I think there was only necessarily going to be one more day, and you had to.
Yeah.
I'll tell you what. It is very hard for countries to understand certain classes of exiles. So, for example, in the U.S., my friends as well as my relatives cannot understand why having won quote-unquote first prize with getting the American citizen, I'm not there. So there's very, very difficult emotions people have with exile. In Turkey, it's not that there was hostility to the idea of this particular group of people being there. In fact, they were mostly very, very, very loved, which is why they stayed and continue to stay. It's that they don't fit into a box. They don't fit into the box of American. They don't fit into the box of Turkey. They don't fit. They don't fit into that the very boxy understanding of the world that we have in the age of nationalism. Yeah, they don't fit when we go back to America or come back here. We don't fit either. But they don't have a way of seeing them. Now, when one of those books of mine that was set in Istanbul came out, and I was interviewed by a very nice young Turkish business person who lives here in London, she said to me, "I'm so impressed that you could know Istanbul of the 1970s so well as a foreigner." And for the first time in my life, I said, because she was younger than me, I said, I'm not a foreigner. In fact, I was there during the 70s and you weren't. And so, she wasn't saying it in an unfriendly way at all. It's just that my perspective, it was hard for her and the others to understand that my perspective might exist. Because everything is, either you're a Turk, preferably if you're a Turk, talking about Turkey, or you're a minority Turk who was talking about that particular thing, or you're the Dünya bizi nasıl görüyor, the foreigner who is gazing from the outside the more intimate and intricate relationships that come with, for example, educators or artists working with other artists, writing, Jimmy Baldwin, having amazing conversations with the Yashar Kemal, even though they had no language in common, and they did, yeah? So those things don't fit into those templates. So I don't think there's any enmity implied or hostility implied by there being nothing on James Baldwin, and also many other quite illustrious people who were there. It's just there's not a way of understanding them as a group, because that is actually what you're trying to do if you're an exile. You're trying not to belong to a group. There's another really curious thing about that particular era, which is so different from the lost generation that advertised itself every other minute. And it's that they wanted to hide, because they were all convinced that if they became visible, their paradise would be destroyed. And so they went out of their way not to write about these places, not to talk about these places. And this was not just in Istanbul. So there's the Robert Graves' village in Mallorca, which I also lived in. Until very recently, because it was all writers and artists, if you wrote about Dea, you got ostracized, because the whole thing is it had to be a secret, and you had to, the only people who were welcome were the people who came with a friend, or people who had been students, and so on. And they, in the atmosphere of the Cold War, they were probably right. The problem is that the memory of all these wonderful escapes and exiles and secret groups of secretly discovering each other people is going to get lost. So now is the time to pull the memories together.